Hey everybody, today we're looking at the intro riff for the song Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. This is a great beginner finger picking riff because it just consists of one simple right hand pattern that repeats for each chord. This riff uses a technique called Travis picking where your thumb plays steady quarter notes, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and the other fingers sometimes play with the thumb, sometimes play in between the thumb notes. So for right hand technique, we're going to do thumb on the A string and the D string. It's going to be bouncing back and forth between those two strings. Index finger on the G string and middle finger on the B string. And the order that we're going to do those fingers in is thumb, index, thumb, middle, thumb, index, thumb. And that's our pattern. So counting wise, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So we're playing on every count except for the and of 4. We just let those notes ring through that count. So for left hand technique, first off, you'll notice that I have a capo on my 3rd fret. You can play this riff without a capo, it doesn't really matter. The only thing is that if you want to play along with the recording, you're going to want to have a capo on the 3rd fret because otherwise you'll be playing the wrong notes. You'll be in the wrong key. So for our left hand technique, we got 3 chords we're moving between. C major, G over B, and A minor 7. You might already know C major. G over B, if you look at the full G chord, full G major chord, notice that we're not playing the low E string or the high E string with our right hand, right? So we don't need these fingers down. So if we take both of those fingers up, we're left with this shape where we're just playing the 2nd fret of the A string and the 3rd fret of the B string. This is the shape we're using for G over B, except for we're using these 2 fingers just because it's a little bit easier to get there. And then A minor 7 is just an A minor chord with an open G string. So we lift up our 3rd finger and now we have an open G string, which gives us an A minor 7. One thing to be aware of is that this song has a pretty fast tempo and you don't want to get too carried away with trying to reach that tempo. Your main focus should be on developing clean and consistent technique. If you focus on the technique, speed will naturally follow. All right, so theory. Before we start talking about keys and chords and that stuff, I want to point out that we are using a capo, and capos complicate that conversation because anytime you use a capo and you're playing chord shapes, you're gonna call that chord shape whatever it is that you're used to that chord shape being. Meaning, if we didn't have this capo on and we use this C major shape, that's a C major chord. If we put the capo on, doesn't matter what fret we put the capo on, this is going to be true. For this song, it's on the 3rd fret. If we put the capo on and we play that C major shape, that's a different sounding chord, right? That's not actually a C major. We call it C major because we're dumb guitarists and this is the shape that we use for C major. So it's much easier for us to think of this as a C major chord, even though the sound that this produces is an E flat major. So that's all to say, we're going to say that this song is in the key of C, even though the actual key of the song is E flat. So getting into the theory, if this stuff confuses you, that's okay. Check out the theory lessons, spend some time with those, and then come back to this part and it'll make more sense. But first we're going to outline the chords. So in the key of C, this C major chord would be our 1 chord, right? So we're going 1, and then this one, G over B, this is going to be our 5 chord, but it's not in root position because we're not playing our low root note of the chord. We're playing B as our lowest note. So this isn't an inversion, it's in 1st inversion because B is the 3rd of G. A minor 7 would be our 6th chord. So we have a 1, and then a 5 in first inversion, and a 6. All right, next thing in line, let's talk about the scale patterns being used. If you didn't get the last stuff where I talked about the chords, you're probably not going to get this either. That's okay. For those of you who are interested and who are far enough along in your theory journey to understand this stuff, this is a scale pattern we're using. So we're in the key of C, right? And we are in open position. So if you're in the key of C and you're in open position, that tells you everything you need to know. You're using, for the main kind of chunk of the notes that you're playing in all these chords, it's a 4th finger pattern. C major, using open strings, of course. For the higher, that's as high as we go, but so that's the first little bit of a 2nd finger pattern up here. And then same pattern for the lower octave, it's the top part of a 2nd finger pattern. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. So we got, so that multi-octave pattern covers us for the entire riff. So for scale degrees, we already outlined our scale pattern, so let's look at which degrees we're using for each one of these chords. So for the 1 chord, the C major here, we got 1, 5, 3, and 1. The 5 chord, we have 7, 5, 2, and a high 2. And for the 6 chord, we have 6, 5, 3, and 1. The other way we want to analyze these notes is in terms of chord tones or chord members. So every note has a couple different identities in a piece of music. It has the scale degree identity, which is fixed, and then it has the chord tone identity, which changes depending on what chord you're playing. So for the 1 chord, it's kind of the same, except for instead of calling this scale degree 1, we call this the root note. So we got root, 5th, 3rd, and a high root. For the 5 chord, now it's going to be different. So instead of calling this scale degree 7, if we're talking about how it relates to the 5 chord, this is the 3rd of the 5 chord. So we got a 3rd, a root, a 5th, and a high octave of the 5th. And then for the 6 chord, we have a root, a 7th, a 5th, and a 3rd. All right, let's look at the note names now. And remember, we're still using the pretend capo version of the note names as opposed to the actual pitches that we're hearing. So for the C major chord, we have C, G, E, and a higher octave of C. For the G over B chord, we have B, G, D, and a higher octave of D. And for the A minor 7 chord, we have A, G, E, and C. So one cool takeaway from this riff is that this right-hand fingerpicking pattern can be used with pretty much any chords and it'll totally work. So if you're writing your own riff or your own song and you have a chord progression but you're not really sure what to do with the rhythm, with the right hand, use this same pattern, it'll work great. Let's say we're doing a B minor to A to E chord progression, and we're using this same right hand pattern. Totally works, right? One thing I want to point out is when you have a chord where the root note is on the low E string instead of the A string, you have a couple options. If you go back and listen to that again, you might notice that the first time I went to the E major chord, I moved all my fingers down a string. So I was hitting E string, D string, A string, G string. The second time I went to the E major chord, I was hitting E string, G string, D string, B string. So this pattern can be kind of changed and tailored to fit whatever chord you're playing, even if the root note doesn't land on the same string as the other chords.